legacy has F.w.Boreham left behind?
Well, I think that most people have been introduced to F.w.Boreham through his books, and with 55 books and more, I think it's a tremendous legacy of a person who was a very able writer, a very winsome communicator. So many of his essays, you could just take up and preach, and he did.
I had an elderly grandmother who was a Seventh-day Adventist and was very anxious that her eldest grandson got good Christian literature. So I would get, and still get to this day actually, Seventh-day Adventist literature. I hate to think of how many hundreds of thousands of dollars they've sent on postage to me, but I enjoy it, and I've spoken at SDA conferences all over the world, in Korea and America and Britain and Europe and so on, and enjoy the fellowship of those Christian people. And I'll never, ever lack gratitude for the fact that I got copies in the very earliest days of their monthly magazine and of Christian books. And among those Christian books, my grandmother gave me a bunch of Everlastings by Boreham. I don't remember much about those early years, except there were some, good stories. I started to preach at youth services and so on when I was 15. And between about 15 and 17, I ran dry every week of new subjects and new things. And back to Boreham I'd go. And I'd find a story which I must admit I often adapted to when I was in Scotland, and would tell a story. And from Boreham had a habit of taking a good story which would get you in. Then he would extrapolate that, and then he would add biblical material and so on. And so I started to follow this kind of preaching.
And I can remember loads and loads of these Boreham books just lying around. Students could help themselves. We didn't know the value of them in those days. A lady came to church one Sunday in my ministry, and a complete stranger to me, and she said to me, this is my first Sunday in Mosgiel. My husband and I have just arrived, and we're looking for a good church. And this is the first church we've attended in Mosgiel. You may not see us again because we're going to shop around the different denominations in Mosgiel to the one that suits our taste. And so we might be back, but if we find something that appeals to us all the more, we'll be there. So I sensed she was a good, keen, dedicated woman. And so I thought, no, I'm going to cash in on this. So the very next day I called on her. She did give me her address or signed the visitor's book, whatever. And the very next day, unexpectedly, I called on her. And she was very hospitable and quite surprised that I was visiting her so soon. But she didn't resent that. That was fine. And so I said, what's your Christian background? When did you become a Christian? I knew she was a Christian. I could sense that was by conversation. She said, well, I got converted through reading a book called The Luggage of Life. And I said, oh yes, that was by F.w.Boreham. She said, yes. She said, that book laid a great impact on my life. She said, do you know something about him? She said, that's the only book I've ever located that I've ever found written by him. I said, well, yes, I've got a number of his books at home, including that one. He used to be the minister of the Mosgiel Baptist Church, the church that you worshipped in yesterday, where I am now the minister of. Well, her mouth just dropped. She had no idea that was the case. No idea in the world, and I don't think she really believed me.
Yeah. What I'm really sad about is that we didn't know what a wonderful man he was. Mm. He's just grandpa. Mm-hmm.
What happened that day in May 1924 marked the highlight of F.w. Boreham's preaching ministry. The announcement of him as a guest speaker attracted so much interest that the mission had to change their venue to the 3,500-seat Queen's Great Hall. But what happened that day caught the organisers off guard.
The London of 1924 was a new world to the Borehams. London streets bristled with motor cars and motorised buses, all honking their way through the city's traffic. Telephones now linked every part of the city and country. Cinemas now screened moving pictures and displayed their flashing advertising to passers-by. And then there was the novelty of listening to this thing Londoners called a wireless. But the strangest thing to Boreham that happened to London was its fascination with him. When he was last here in 1903, he was a virtual unknown, but now he was known to millions. On his arrival at Queen's Hall, he was instantly recognised from his portrait on his books, so that he was mobbed by those who broke the queue to greet him. He barely made it into the anteroom in time for the meeting.
When I arrived at Queen's Hall, it was packed from floor to ceiling, with apparently thousands more outside unable to get in. I was given a great welcome. The sight of the immense audience stirred me deeply. I felt that I must pull myself together and be at my best in spite of everything. Bishop Taylor Smith had some kind things to say about my books by way of introduction, and then I had my innings.
Frank Boreham was a pastor, a minister. He officially pastored 3 churches: Mosgiel, New Zealand, Hobart, Tasmania, and Armidale in Melbourne, Australia. Despite being lauded as one of the greatest preachers of all time, who was even honoured by a young Queen Elizabeth with an OBE for services to preaching, and someone whose book sales would total in the millions, Frank Boreham always saw himself as a pastor. Boreham's path to ministry arguably began when Charles Haddon Spurgeon heard Frank street preaching on the streets of Clapham and invited him to study at his pastor's college with a full scholarship. Although Spurgeon died just days after signing Boreham's application into the college, Frank entered pastor's college in August 1892. A year later, he was assigned a student pastorate at Thaden Boys. These Baptist missions were small churches where the senior student assumed the role of pastor and his juniors would assist.
Only wise men learn from experience. I had undertaken to lecture in a small country chapel on Robert Moffat. It occurred to me that a picture of the missionary would greatly assist the effect of the lecture. Nowhere could I find one. In the biography that I had so carefully studied, there was a small engraving, but this was too insignificant to be of any use. Oh, and then came a brainwave. Why not draw a life-size portrait from this tiny one? I bought the parchment, set to work, and not to put too fine a point upon it, was more than pleased with the result. And on the day of the lecture, I took my masterpiece to the chapel and hung it just above the pulpit. I liked the look of it, and before leaving the building, I again surveyed it with pride from the porch. Then, emerging onto the village green, I chanced to encounter a young lady in whose aesthetic and artistic taste I had implicit confidence. I explained the reason for my visit to the chapel at that most unusual hour, and begged her to return and inspect my handiwork. A few minutes later, we were standing side by side in the aisle, examining the sketch over the pulpit. Greatly daring, I asked her opinion. It should, she observed thoughtfully, be a very valuable picture. This completely took my breath away. I had fondly hoped that with characteristic courtesy and charity, she might perhaps say that it would answer to its purpose, but a very valuable picture? I'd never dreamed of so dazzling a bouquet. And may I ask, I resumed in the moment of my elation, why do you think it's so valuable? Well, you see, she replied, with a charming smile, you happen this evening to be lecturing on Robert Moffat, but in the days to come, you may find yourself lecturing on other men, and that, she continued, glancing at my picture, would fit any conceivable occasion. I felt that no punishment could be too severe for a young lady who could be guilty of such cold-blooded cruelty. So, later on, I married her, but that's another story.
He had previously heard from the other students that the village was delightful, but that the girls were even more delightful, especially the girls of one of the families in the church, the Cotty family.
But on August the 2nd, 1893, for FWB there was no more visiting to Thaden Boyce. With the graduation of the previous student pastor, Fred King, the Thaden Boyce pastorate fell to Boreham. This time he was hosted by Mr. and Mrs. Cotty. He instantly liked his hosts and their girls, but it was their youngest daughter Stella, admired for her good looks, wit and quiet charm, who stirred new and delightful emotions in Boreham.